Okay, this is a much needed general response to a particular instantiation of this philosophical quandary, or there are a lot of general points that I need to make that are packaged into this very specific incident that I want to get into. So, listening to the interview between Alex Kazemi, sorry, I might have the surname wrong. I'm not looking at the title, but with Sam Vaknin, they go into very interesting, deep conversation. They have lots of things that they're saying that are very interesting and nice. And technically, I have to say that everything that Sam Vaknin says is not wrong, but I think that his moral framing on some of these issues are very wrong. But that's not the same thing as him making up fake facts or something like that. That there is a slanting of the facts in a very sort of cherry picked way, which is problematic in a moral landscape because it is, first of all, it's reductive, which is quite ironic because he talks about reduction quite intelligently, and I think this might have something to do with also Sam Vaknin's narcissism. Which, I mean, I don't want to get this. I don't want to get too much into ad hominem territory, but Sam Vaknin is obviously very good at identifying beliefs, and I think that in some sense he has a general tendency towards sympathizing with the existence of someone's belief set rather than essentially, I mean, maybe he's just being sort of extra jaded and cynical in his treatment and framing of these issues. So I don't even know exactly how to phrase my critique. Um, it's almost like a nuanced and qualified extension of what Sam Vaknin would have said in a more morally robust ethical framework, which I would say that he was not representing in some sense. And maybe he thought he was just talking about sort of neutral things, but it's ironic that also in some general sense he is exacerbating or adding to the persistence and the maintenance of the psychopathy that is at work within the culture by reifying its narrative and by essentially solidifying it, or lending it a kind of credence. Okay, so that's the general heading that I'm going to get into substantiating. Okay, so that's my general thesis. Okay, let me explain how this happened. So there are two incidents where this occurred within the interview, right at the end, and when he was basically talking about the manosphere. And okay, now I think the manosphere needs to be defended in principle, not because of the attitudes that it contains, but because of its underlying grievances, which are real. So just because you could say that the manosphere is just as toxic as fourth wave feminism or something like that, we have to move into a framework that goes beyond identity politics. We have to move into a framework that is capable of being soluble. And when you want to talk about 10,000 years of female oppression and slavery, I mean, I can understand what you're referring to. Perhaps, that we have cultural objects, we have cultural artifacts, we have symbolism which we have inherited to some degree, and that needs to be renegotiated. Now, how is that ever going to be renegotiated if we're going to confect this strange narrative and this moral framework, which is frankly insoluble, that these women share this heritage with this 10,000 years of slavery and oppression, which I will also say is a bit too much of a generalization. Is just way it's actually an irresponsible oversimplification that lends way too much credence to the moral paradigm of group centric moral consideration, investing moral consideration in the identity and in the group membership in some sense. And this, I mean, ironically also conflates, the gender sex um, distinction as well. This is what permits it, but in some sense, the ability for psychopathy to be engaged in is the lack of a common sense of justice, common standards, shared standards. And how do shared standards ever come into being? They come to being from analysis, from a kind of analytical um, treatment of issues. And how can you ever have an analytical treatment of issues when you're experiencing it as an X identity or as a Y identity? It's not soluble. And to reify that narrative and to give it a kind of moral currency is in some sense to invest into the systemic psychopathy which the morality is sort of prone to. Now, and let me also make a point at the end, because this is much the same kind of argument. Sam Vaknin, very clearly says that, there is a kind of slavery which is being projected or being engaged in due to the elites' interface with society and culture. I agree and I disagree. I understand the way in which that can be reductively, a valid description on some level. But again, it's an insoluble framework. You can very easily reframe this to make it soluble, and it really has to do with blame. The reason why we have a culture which is amenable to this kind of plutocratic sympathy that's entrenched within its kind of systemic functioning is because people don't hold themselves accountable for participating in a culture that does this sort of thing. And I mean this in terms of people don't blame themselves. They don't hold themselves responsible for being enslaved because they just say, oh, it's the elites that are doing the enslaving. And so culture becomes, which could be part of the solution, is already seeded, is already sort of, as an instrument and as a tool, it's already forgone. By essentially adopting a narrative in which blame is diverted, because blame really is a currency of power. If you blame yourself, then you actually have power. If you blame somebody else, then you've given your power away. And in some sense, I think that's part of the general overarching residual oppression that exists, that we inhabit in some sense, is this undeveloped culture that is not developed as a resource, that could be a way of framing issues and framing problems in such a way that it's the next step becomes in some sense things have to be held in such an insoluble kind of framing so that a politician can excuse, in terms of some rationale, a real political engagement that leaves the problem unattended to. The real problem is that politics can't attend to problems because culture can't allow them to be crystallized in such a way that they actually become soluble. And so this is the difference, I think, between a kind of narrative reduction that have a kind of moral insolubility worked through them already in an a priori sort of sense. And people need to be blamed for having these kinds of toxic ideological outlooks. And this is why I have much more sympathy for the manosphere than I do for fourth wave feminism, because fourth wave feminism is part of this retarded moral reduction in which 10,000 years of oppression is somehow confected into an ongoing issue that somehow needs to be tackled symbolically in the present for the past, which is just, it's malevolent, basically. It's retributivistic and while perpetrating a kind of that the moral debt is owned collectively, so it's sort of, it's anti-liberal, it's very regressive, it's very, in some sense it really has the seeds of a kind of, it has the same morality as kind of ethno-fascism, except that it's a kind of transnational ethno-fascism, and the nation of the identity is the faction itself, and it needs to be pandered to and infantilized in that it needs to be addressed as a kind of, as a real political interest in a kind of where nations no longer have real interests, but identities do. And so that's why I kind of call it a transnational ethno-fascism. Okay, the whereas the manosphere, in whatever way you might want to say that their sentiments are the same as fourth wave feminism, they're talking about ongoing problems, which are like equality before the law issues. We're actually ignoring real inequality for a kind of ideological narrative confection of complaint of historic inequality. It's pretty disgusting. These things are completely different issues. You can say that the one is a strange, sort of cultural map of how we've been inbred with cultural artifacts and symbolism and association and stereotyped thinking or whatever. Well, what is the best way to actually ameliorate all of these negative forces? To embrace the moral insolubility of the collective guilt and the group narrative and group moralizing, or to responsibly deal with these things and then have the effects of oppression essentially evolve out of the system. Now, I do think that there are a lot of bad faith arguments as to why you need some kind of like cultural Marxism, or why you need some kind of like overreaction to precipitate a kind of conflagration in which, I mean, in some sense, I do think that all the sort of the incel toxicity, in some sense, has been bred directly by fourth wave feminism in order for it to have this reenactment and dramatization of their oppression, that in some sense they're confecting the reason why they should be oppressed in some sense. I think it's close to that kind of echo of history, that they're showing their utter unaccountability and irresponsibility and sort of extravagant indulgence into borderline sort of values and things like that. And why are these things able to manifest and emerge? Is because we don't have a strong enough moral edifice that suppresses these toxic things. And that goes along with their narratives, that buys into them, that gives them credence, that lends them their murky atmosphere that is needed in order to inculcate and operate these things. And this is a dogma which is very rife in the psychological community. I don't know why. I mean, I guess it's because, if you are a clinician and you have to deal with individuals and you say, well, your beliefs are a reflection of the beliefs that are in culture, that are in society, and you've been imprinted by these beliefs, and these beliefs, therefore, in relation to my patients, are the conditions that they have to deal with. Therefore, if they have a moral belief compass that treats those things as like as the rubric of how morality is meant to be played out, or how morality is meant to be engaged in, then that kind of conditioning, that kind of imprinting, is something that just must be sympathized with and doubled down into and sort of and escalated. Which is, in some sense, it's like the teacher of the kindergarten getting into the squabble, as far as I can see. I mean, and um, and then it uses the same hysterical, oversimplified, reductive reasoning to justify getting into the childish squabble. Oh well, yes, the one story is true. It's been 10,000 years of slavery. I mean, and this is the problem: is that in order to sustain that toxic narrative, you have to make very unnuanced, very oversimplified falsehoods. You have to end up manufacturing them in order to sustain the idea that, yes, the experience of woman was slavery. I mean, like, how many equivocations do you have to make in order to really, I mean, how many stories of woman wielding power in history? Like, I mean, to make that fit, to make that round peg fit in a square hole. It just doesn't, to go along with this bandwagon in some sense. I guess to believe that the bandwagon has some redeeming quality about it, or that it has some potential in it, that it's not just a kind of extravagant indulgence into a kind of retributivistic um, resentfulness and a kind of yeah. I do think that this is generally, actually, it's more to do with the fact that more women do have a tendency towards borderline, and they have corrupted the culture as they have for aeons. I should probably correct my pronunciation, because I don't mean to say aeon as in the Gnostic, but eons, as they have done for eons, which is ironically what has been the obstacle to what was predicted by Jung in the aeon. But anyway, this is what we're working through. Um, and jumping on the bandwagon and reifying the insoluble confection is really just promoting and fueling the psychopathy in some sense. It's reifying the precondition and the prerequisite that is needed in order for it to operate. Um, I mean, this is why, yes, we have a plutocracy, but I blame the plebs. I blame the common folk. It's their fault that we have a plutocracy. It's because it's always the revolutionaries that are in their revolutionary ideology that are creating the false consciousness, that are being the real obstacles for real progress, because we can't have a sophisticated culture, we can't have a developed thing. And this in some sense is to do because these people have weak characters, they have weak undeveloped psychologies, um, they have personality styles which are fundamentally captured, and they just want their own little psychological fiefdom of narcissistic supply, or whatever you may have, or a kind of collective borderline entity, a collective vampire. Um, this is the real problem. That if we could clean that up on a cultural level, then everything else would fall into place very easily. But we can't clean that up because they're too sanctimonious. They're cognitive dissonance. One hand washes the other, and they're just stuck in the narrative. Oh, I need to make a recording about narratives. But anyway, yeah, I guess that's a sort of standalone thing. I'm gonna stop the recording.